This miniature was primed using Vallejo's matte black through an airbrush. As this is the only step I used the airbrush for, you would not need an airbrush if you were to use this video as a guide. However, if you do, watch until the end before following along, as I make some mistakes, and some of the steps I take should be removed or reordered. These Canoptek Scarab Swarm miniatures are the first Warhammer 40k miniatures I have painted. I chose them because I thought it would make for a quick and easy project, with the exception of all the edge highlighting on their tiny appendages. One major thing to note about Warhammer is the color schemes. Each faction has sub-factions replete with their own color scheme, and there are a lot of sub-factions to choose from. There are even rules to build your own custom factions with their own custom schemes, making your investment into the Warhammer world satisfyingly customizable. These scarabs are from the Necrons faction, an ancient alien race where most of them were tragically duped into becoming mindless robots by another ancient alien race. Personally, I like the scheme of their sub-faction known as the Szarekhan Dynasty. Szarekhan Dynasty? I've heard the word pronounced as Szarekhan by nearly everyone who I've seen say it, including Warhammer personnel in painting tutorials from YouTube. However, the Necrons clearly draw influence from the Egyptians, and words beginning with SZ in ancient Egyptian are pronounced as sh. However, with that in mind, this is the 41st millennium and Old Earth, and Terra terms have been entirely lost or changed. For example, America is historically referred to in 40k as just America. And this could arguably be another change caused by the passage of unimaginable time. That's the beauty of 40k. The amount of lore and history alone, forget about the game and hobby, just the story is staggering. Hundreds of books, magazines, 10 editions of game books from each faction, some with multiple books each, all only offering mere snippets into a story that dwarfs the scope and scale of any other 10 major fictional universes you can think of combined, short of comic books. The drawbacks for getting started into Warhammer? Where do you start? More importantly, are you able to accept that you're just not going to know everything, and that there are a lot of unfinished and unanswered questions in this immersive world that is still slowly expanding? And this is why I put off painting Warhammer for so long. I played maybe 10 games and read over a dozen books. In the grand scheme of things, this is just a drop in the bucket, and it's already easy to go on an endless rant for this game. Either you avoid it, you hate it, or you absolutely love it. To get back on track, I chose the Szarekhan Dynasty because I just love this color scheme. So I start with creating a small grid in XPS foam to test how the Speedpaints will look over the metallics. The indentions will give me an idea of how the colors will look in the recesses. With the pattern drawn out, I base coat it with dark aluminum and let it dry before adding coppery Speedpaints in small blocks to build my references. I repeat this with a few black, gray, and blue colors, and then again with greens. I make sure to keep track of what colors for which set of blocks, which was easy since I'm recording all of this. From these I make my decision. Nuclear Sunrise for the coppers, Tyrian Navy for the steel, and Ghillie Dew for the glowing bits. Ultimately, I decide to add Shamrock Green, Bright Red, and more Tyrian Navy for shades later on. I begin applying Vallejo's dark aluminum metallic paint as the base coat. I could have done this with an airbrush to save time, but the cold weather wasn't allowing it. I had been smart enough to prime them with the airbrush before the cold front came in at least. While applying this extremely thin paint with the brush, use a cheap one, as the metallic flakes will damage your bristles over time, and the paint is so thin that it'll wick right up into your ferrule. I found it best to apply this paint slowly, as it'll tend to bubble up if you do not. After the dark aluminum dries, I apply dark tone wash everywhere and then let that dry as well. I then dry brush silver, another running metallic paint from Vallejo. This is the first notable mistake I made. The scarabs are so small, and due to the curvature of their insectoid body, it's easy to paint the inside of the joints with the dry brush, where we just darkened with wash. I'll have to go back and rewash some of these spots. It would have been more efficient to base coat with the dark aluminum, dry brush with silver, and then add the dark tone wash. It doesn't take long for me to make my second major mistake. I go in and add a thin edge highlight here around every edge I can get to. The edge highlighting takes up at least half of the total time I spent on this entire project. In retrospect, I should not have done it here, as I come back and do it again later. When edge highlighting with these thin metallics, I also found I had to remove most of the paint from the brush to the point that I was almost dry brushing with a fine point. Otherwise, the metallic paint would just flow everywhere. Thinning Tyrian Navy with speed paint medium, I began applying it to all of the legs and smaller areas beneath the armored carapace. I'm using a cheap brush for this as well, since speed paints and contrast paints, over time, can damage your best brush by soaking into the ferrule. Once it dries, I apply another coat of Tyrian Navy sparingly, to act as a shade. For the carapace, I apply a thin nuclear sunrise as a tint, followed by an unthinned nuclear sunrise as a shade. I then add bright red as a final shade, just across the bottom of the carapace. This step went relatively quick, though I moved slow enough to not accidentally paint over any of the legs. With the Vallejo aluminum I had used before, I re-edge highlight everything. This is the only time I should have done any of the edge highlighting. Thank you, Bran. That's very loud. At this point, I call the carapace and steely body parts finished and move on to the glowing eye and orb on the back. I base coat these with an equal ratio of arid earth and matte white over 2 coats. It's important to keep these coats as smooth as possible without building any unintentional thank you. Damn it, Bran. It's important to keep these coats as smooth as possible without building any unintentional texture. Texture created by paint here will show horribly when we begin adding green speed paints later. Here I add matte white dots for the brightest spots on the eyes and spheres. Be cognizant of the size of these dots, as we'll repeat this step again later, albeit with smaller dots centered within these. With everything dry, I add thin ghillie dew to the orbs and eyes. I'm not worried about getting a little bit around the edges bordering the orbs and eyes, as this will only help the OSL effect later. With thin shamrock green, I carefully add this around the center of the orbs and eyes. Again, I'm not worried about getting this around the bordering carapace. The main concern is not getting it anywhere too far away from the glowing objects, as I did here on the uppermost scarab, which I had to fix later. I also apply the shamrock green around the outside of the orbs, careful to avoid the top of the spheres. I apply more matte white dots, this time smaller and centered on the white dots I had painted several steps ago, before finishing with a little jungle green around the borders of the orbs for the OSL. This is the end result. I'm content enough with how these came out, especially with how little time and effort it took, though I may tweak the recipe slightly for future Necron miniatures that I paint. I do want to mention that if you paint your own Canoptek Scarab swarms, to put the base textures down before you attach the scarabs. Applying the texture paste under these things without getting the paste on the legs was incredibly difficult, and that's going to bring this video to an end. I hope you learned something or were inspired to start or expand your own foray into the world of Warhammer 40k. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Till the next video.